and cannot see me, that's me on the left. Best wedding photo ever, if you ask me. I'm a senior software engineer at Clover Health. Yes, we're hiring. Let's talk later. We also do engineering remotely, so. I've been interested in issues of representation and diversity for like 15 plus years now, and I love that my technical skills allow me to affect how we go about doing things at Clover Health to improve diversity and inclusion. So you chose to be in this room, you're gonna get one of them. You can follow me on Twitter at Zuckerpunch, or if you are interested in the web app I'm gonna show you later, DM me and I will send it to you. I'm like too embarrassed about the code to put it publicly on GitHub anywhere, so it's not there. But if you want to talk about any of these things, let me know. So the fact that tech is struggling to hire or retain employees from diverse backgrounds has been written about and discussed extensively. The economic, social, and moral benefits of diversity are also super well documented. So why is it hard for well-intentioned organizations to shift their demographics? There are a number of reasons, of course. There's no silver bullet, but one that does not appear to have been thoroughly discussed enough, if you ask me, is the challenge of gathering and responding to data about diversity within a company's hiring pool and with their existing employees. One hack day, I was involved in a few too many projects and could only devote a token amount of time to the one I was really interested in, which was seeing if we could determine whether we had sufficient diversity for any given role to start interviewing candidates, or if we needed to spend more time sourcing candidates from diverse backgrounds for the pipeline. So I accomplished an MVP in approximately an hour once I had an API key and permissions, which turns out that was the hardest part. But it doesn't actually, if you take anything away from this talk, let it be this. It doesn't require a huge effort to make a big difference. I'm a perfectionist, so I always used to think if something's worth doing, it's worth doing well. But also, if something is worth doing, it's worth doing poorly first, so that at least you have something, right? So here's what you're in for. In this talk, I'll walk through my MVP, indicating for each role whether it was sufficient diversity. And then I'll talk about what our V2 was, and I'll also address some gotchas and limitations so that you don't have to make the same mistakes that I did. And then we'll go forth on the what now, the glorious future. Y'all in? All right, let's do it. Okay, so disclaimer, I put together this web app for a Hack Day project. This is my MVP. The front end literally has no styles in it. It was as bare bones as can be, but it works, and that's what's important, right? It's a simple Django web app. It has one view. It makes real-time API calls to Greenhouse to fetch data. Who works at a company that uses Greenhouse? Yeah, it's a pretty commonly used tool. It has an API. It's pretty handy. There are other tools that you could use, and I think those also have APIs. This is just the one that we happen to have. So this is pretty hacky code, and in production, this would like never fly with that nested for loop, and performance of this code is terrible. I'll show you more about that later. But as a proof of concept, it's really effective to give people a chance to see exactly how homogeneous or diverse our candidate pool was at the top of the funnel for any given role. So this is my one Django view for the project. It gets a list of jobs. It gets, for each job, all the applications to that job. And then for each application, it goes back to Greenhouse and fetches the EEOC data associated with that application. It does a little number smushing, which you'll see on a later slide. And it renders a list of jobs with data about how diverse the candidate pool is for each job. So by the way, in case you were wondering, EEOC is Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, because I need to look it up every time. The API calls are not super fancy. They're just some hard-coded URLs. I hit Greenhouse's API and load the data for the 3 endpoints. You can see it's very abstracted, right? No. And so this is where I add an application status to a dictionary for each job. It says like women tally, and then disability status, there's a tally. For race, for each of the races that there are, there's a tally. I anonymize and tally the number of applicants who self-attest as belonging to a protected group, and display only aggregates for each role on one page. Here's what it looks like. Isn't it beautiful? For any role, it says whether there is sufficient diversity, and we'll talk about sufficient diversity later, to move forward with interviewing candidates for the role. So stylish. Okay, so that was my MVP. And that was like approximately an hour of time, but I have visions for the future. So what was our V2? So normally, when you're hitting your website to get data, you don't want people to have to wait 10 minutes to see results, right? That's not just me. And when you first get all the jobs, and then the applications for each of those jobs, and then the EEOC data for each of those jobs, that's a lot of API calls. This is what my terminal output looks like when I make this request, and it just goes on and on for pages. Obviously, that's not ideal. It'd be much better to collect the data regularly, store it in a database where we can make fewer queries faster by using table relationships, right? So our first order of business is to sync new data from Greenhouse to our database. Then there's no synchronous API calls to a third party, and our page can load in a snap. The next hurdle is, how do we know what data is new? How do we upsert changes without getting everything fresh each load? That's a problem for future Nicole. For now, it's enough to drop and create every time, and I cringe every time I say that, but like, it does the job. Another thing we decided to do for V2 was to only show diversity stats for candidates who have already exited the pipeline. Otherwise, there's potential for a hiring manager looking at this stuff to see a candidate we're still evaluating and go, oh, we already have enough veterans for this year. Let's not hire this one because that's illegal. So the other thing we wanted to accomplish was showing diversity at every step of the pipeline, not just the top of the funnel, from the recruiter screen all the way through offer acceptance, and being able to slice data to see the story for a particular group, or from a particular source, or from a particular recruiter. So that's all well and great, but there were some things that made this a little hard. Be careful with people-sensitive data. Where can you host it so that not everyone can access it? We anonymize our data when pulling in information about candidates using the API, so we didn't store any information that's personally identifiable for anyone, just their EEOC stuff and their candidate ID, which isn't identifiable unless you have the Greenhouse API key. Which brings up another thing. Put your API keys in a private place, and I'm not talking about a place that's accessible to all of engineering. Otherwise, even if you have your database stored in a place where not everyone can access all of the data, if they can access the API key, they can get the data for themselves. And then they can slice and get information from people who are currently in the pipeline and make those illegal decisions. I recommend you be sensitive about who can see this information. Maybe everyone should get the 10,000-foot view at an all hands. That's the cookies. But being able to view per role slicing on different tags, you might want to have limited access to have people see things at a more granular level. We decided to show results only for groups of a minimum pool size or greater, even though that meant that we get data on a slower cadence than real time, in order to give the pool size a chance to get large enough for real anonymity. Beware combinations. Veterans who have a disability, who are of a certain gender and a certain race, is identifiable without anonymity. If you want to see musicians, that's one group. If you want to see the Muppets that are blue, that's another group. But if you're like, give me the blue Muppets who are musicians, it's only that one, and we all know who that is. So don't show slices of multiple things at the same time unless that slice fits or exceeds a minimum pool size. Plus Muppets. Let me stress again how important our decisions were about anonymizing data. In addition to not allowing slicing until a resulting group was above a particular pool size, or not including that part about not including candidates who are currently active in the pipeline in your results is vital, because you don't want to make hiring decisions based on that information that you're not supposed to make hiring decisions. Like that example of we have enough veterans for this year. We don't need to hire this one. You don't want to run into those legal ramifications. I'm just an engineer. I don't have sufficient confidence that my web app is bug-free and there's absolutely no way to get identifiable slices of data. So only when those puppies have exited the pipeline do we count them, unless you are super duper confident that no one is going to be able to like figure something out with your site. Another problem we ran into was that not everyone fills out this information. It's sparse. It's not available for referrals or for candidates that are sourced internally. And even on the website, not everyone chooses to fill it out. Understanding why data is sparse is clutch in figuring out what you can do to mitigate it. And understanding what makes data sparse has a lot to do with humans, turns out, and solutions are usually specific to the particular group. What works for employees is not the same as what works to get more data from candidates. Folks are often, especially if they don't know your organization very well, like candidates, they're often suspicious about what you're going to do with their information. Will it be used against them in some way? Whereas with your employees, you, I hope, have a little bit more trust built up. And sometimes there's no opportunity to collect data from non-system inputs, like source candidates. So try to, if you can, put processes in place on like the recruiting side to make sure that you gather that information. That's one way to handle that. Another hang-up was that sometimes the data we need to collect by law doesn't match up entirely with what we want to collect or what people might be willing to divulge, and we're limited by what it's legal to ask. We need to decide what labels and groups to include. Like for gender questions, what will our options be? I know that there are non-binary humans for whom the labels like male and female or like man and woman don't really apply. So how do you take into account that when the government requires that you ask like male, female? Also, making a survey is an art unto itself, and it's possible to ask questions and elicit a response that you did not intend. Just so you all know, federal contractors are required to request this information for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. There's certain questions that you have to ask, and if they don't match up with what you'd like to ask, that leads to having like multiple surveys, which causes survey fatigue. There's also suspicion. So find out what you need to do and decide what the best balance is for you. Great balance. In terms of like survey fatigue or like getting the questions answered that you really want. So now we get to the part that I find really interesting. What actually constitutes sufficient diversity? Well, it turns out with 0 diverse candidates in a pool, you're obviously not going to hire anyone from an underrepresented group. But according to a handful of studies that the Harvard Business Review did, even with 1 candidate from a minority group in the pool, that person has like 0 chance of actually getting hired because of our preference for the status quo. And there's this great quote in that article: deviating from the norm can be risky for decision makers because people tend to ostracize people who are different from the group. So for women and minorities, having your differences made salient can lead to an inference of incompetence. So if you're the only woman in a pool of finalists, it highlights how she is different from the norm and makes her an inherently riskier candidate and likely one that you won't go with. But if you have even 2 people from an underrepresented group, they actually stand a chance of getting hired. The odds of hiring a minority were 193 times greater if there were at least 2 minority candidates in the finalist pool. Controlling for the number of other minority and white finalists, controlling for pool size, so like that is not inflated. How impressive is that? But 2 candidates? Come on, that's a pretty low bar. What we saw was if there was like a relatively small pool of finalists, like 6 finalists, 8 finalists, if you've got an applicant pool for a role like software engineer, you're going to have far more candidates to choose from. So even if you have 2 people from a minority group represented, if there's 1,000 people in the in-group, even if you put aside unconscious bias, which totally exists and will whittle down your diversity of your candidate pool at every step of the pipeline, and if you put aside our status quo fix of having 2 candidates, you're still statistically unlikely to hire someone different from the status quo, because you have 2 of them against 1,000 other probably equally qualified candidates. So what can we do then? I've got a crazy idea. Why not go for parity with the eligible labor force in the US? Then at least if the top of your funnel is balanced, you stand a greater chance of having those people make it through your hiring process. Not that it's smooth sailing from there, we still need to institute systems to limit the effective unconscious bias in the rest of the hiring pipeline, but at least it's a start. This is part of a table of race and gender in the potential labor force. The base number is 1,000. So for 2017, the total number of Black women in the workforce was 10.5 million out of 17.5 million Black women who could have been in the labor force. Not all of these people are qualified for every job or even are interested, but if we support programs that give training and opportunities to underrepresented groups, while we also try to get as close as possible to having our pipeline represent the population pool, someday those might converge and we'll get there. But aim for the stars. We're doing this now at Clover Health. So that glorious future that I talked about, what does it look like? I found out after I did my MVP and when I was halfway through V2 that there's actually a company that does a lot of this for you. And we ultimately decided to use them for the future so that engineering hours don't need to support this web app, this hacky web app that I made indefinitely. We didn't discover until we were deep in V2. So could we have done research to discover that this company existed first and save ourselves some work? Absolutely. Would anyone have thought to Google it before I made my MVP? Probably not. We found out about this company through our diversity and inclusion manager, who joined right after I made my MVP. So if you have diversity and inclusion folks at your company, talk to them early. This company is called typica, and they'll, if you connect them with your recruiting tracking software and give them an API key or something like that, they will look at your candidate pool and do the slicing by role or by department, by stage in the pipeline, and they also do analysis to figure out how to solve the sparsity problem of the data so that they have an 80 or 90-something% accuracy rate in determining gender and race. And they don't do it just by photo recognition or facial recognition, so I think that's pretty cool. If you don't have the budget to outsource the way that we ultimately did, the web app we talked about is perfectly usable, though. It probably requires a little further iteration to handle the sparsity of data problem that we were talking about. But even if your time is limited, the MVP is still better than nothing at all. If you go this route, make sure to include any D&I people at your company. You'll need weigh-in from HR and recruiting, as well as possibly legal. But if you're willing to do the work, most of the time, folks are happy to give you their opinion and send you on your way. But don't try to do this without the knowledge of what's legal, without consulting anyone. Doing the problem solving without these people would have been a huge mistake for me, because I'm just an engineer, and you can't just tell me to implement a data ingest, because I'll do that, but I should be part of the design of the thing, but I don't have all the answers about what we should do, what we can do legally. And also, you can't just not include engineering in this task, because obviously we all know that we have useful opinions. And boy, do we have opinions. So the next challenge is, how do you integrate data for current employees with information that's available for your hiring pipeline? They're two separate sources of information, and geez, but reconciling them is like pulling teeth. I just found out earlier this week, though, that typica now has an API that you can use for looking at information, I think about promotion and retention and stuff for your existing employees. So hey, maybe this problem is basically solved for me, and I just need to go check out their API documentation, which I'm honestly likely going to do on the plane home. So now, when you identify departments or roles where there isn't representation across different groups, the next step is going back and sourcing from those missing groups. If there's a big drop-off at one step of the recruiting funnel, investigate why people are leaving there. So this is fake data, but this is actually a report that I pull from typica quarterly. So for one role, you see the counts and the pass-through rates for men versus women for each stage of the pipeline. At the beginning, you start with 100 men, 50 women. It's not representative of the population, but it's not awful either. But in the application and resume stage, 50% of men make it through, but only 20% of women make it through. So it looks like you need to take a look at what's happening in your resume review stage, huh? At the phone screen stage, you have many more men than women, 50 and 10 respectively, but they make it through at the same rate. So that stack, that frame seems to be okay. Then for the on-site, you have 80% of men making it through, but only 33% of women. So you probably need to take a deeper look at what may be happening during that stage. And because I work at a great place, everyone accepts their offer, but wow, we lost a chance to hire women at the resume and on-site stages. This is hard, but it's really worth it. Since this problem is one of people and systems, it's inherently challenging, especially if you're a person who's at the apex of privilege in our society. But do what you can. It's worth it to even go 50% of the way rather than not do anything. From one perfectionist to another, admit that you won't have it perfect. Try to build process around data collection wherever you can. And please don't guess about people unless it's required by law, or outsource to a company like a Typica that does it professionally. They're less likely to mess up than a biased human, even a well-intentioned one. And if you are at the apex of privilege, cis white het men, you should involve people from underrepresented groups to be involved in the process. Listen to them, because they know how things are going to come across, but please don't make them do the lion's share of the work. My recommendation is to solicit their opinion early and often, do some work, show them what you did and ask for feedback, but don't make them carry this whole boulder by themselves. So these are just some examples of what I have done at Clover Health. There's a ton of other things you can do to instrument your hiring pipeline or measure changes in inclusion at your company. Share out what worked and what didn't work for you so that we as a community can learn from each other and develop best practices. There's no reason for the best practices about diversity and inclusion to remain a secret. I want this special sauce all over tech. So this is me. And that's my dog, Chloe. You can follow her on Instagram, Corgi in the front, because her front legs are a little shorter than her back ones. And I work at Clover Health. We are totally hiring. Come work with me. And like I said, we hire remote engineers. The end.
Minutes for questions. If you guys want to stamp up the microphones and ask your questions, please.
Nicole, why is your hair so good? Oh, I don't know. I was born that way. I'm a natural purple.
Okay, so I have two questions. First is, have you considered tying diversity goals to things like compensation and bonuses for the people in the recruiting team? And also, what are your thoughts on the benefits of standardized interviews in removing bias from the interview phases?
My brain is a sieve. Let's do one at a time. The first one is tying compensation and bonuses to like how you do on these diversity stuff. At my company, we have a one role, one compensation policy, basically so that like women and minorities don't get underpaid in the first place. So we don't have that. It's a good idea, I think, if you don't have this policy, to reinforce like that people should actually put their efforts toward this by putting your money where your mouth is. I think that our like top level executives are going to be held accountable to these numbers over time, now that we can measure them, and also for our internal employees, like retention and stuff like that. If we see those numbers diving, I think the plan is to hold leadership accountable for that. So does that answer your question?
Kind of, but it's very easy to say people will be held accountable,
For sure.
but then you don't, like, it's hard for me to believe that people in leadership will be held accountable for things like this, because they generally aren't. And when people say held accountable, they never say how they will be held accountable.
Yeah, this actually came up in an all hands that we had like a month ago or so, where it's like, okay, so we're making these like part of our OKRs for the company, but like what happens if we miss them? Who's going to be the one saying to our like CEO or whatever, like, you didn't reach diversity numbers, you're out. And honestly, we've only been doing this for like a year or so the proof will be in the pudding, but I, as like a relatively privileged human in the system, feel like it's my responsibility to say, hey, we said we were gonna hold people accountable, what have we actually done? And we'll see if it actually works. I agree with you that like 90% of the time people are like, yeah, we really care about this stuff and people will be held accountable, and then nothing changes. But I personally intend to remind people of these promises, and if they don't follow through on them, then like that is something I will absolutely agitate about, because I feel like I'm fortunately in a position where like I don't have to worry about staying employed, so like I can afford to fight for it. Does that help? Yeah. What was your second question?
Using standardized interviews to help remove unconscious bias.
Yeah. I actually gave a talk at PyGotham, I think, with James, who was sitting up here a few minutes ago, and we talked about some of the benefits of like anonymizing resumes, taking out information that would let people figure out your gender or your race, like from name or from like college you attended, or like where age is concerned, like the years that you were doing something. And I know that there are other tools out there that that make the process even better for like the phone screen or like the on-site or whatever, where it basically removes the identifiable information like voice recognition, but there's some things that we can't do, like speech patterns and stuff, where I think that is still like the next frontier, where we're not going to be able to isolate bias from the hiring pipeline entirely until we get to some of those things. But I do totally think that we should make it so that it is not abundantly clear when you're interviewing someone what their background is. We should at least try it and see how that goes, because I fully believe that there are qualified minorities and women and people with disabilities out there. I think we just don't perceive them that way because of, unconscious bias.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned at the outside that one of the challenges you had was getting an API key. What were some of the things you experienced sort of working with HR at the outset, just convincing them that this project was worth doing and getting rolling with it?
Fortunately, my HR folks are like totally on board with this. I had to ask. I wasn't asking them to do anything except give me the key, so that helps. Like, it didn't require work on their part. Although now they're like happy to take advantage of the information that I can give them, and as it informs their process. But at the beginning, I had to say like, hey, I want an API key, and here's the reasons. And they were like, okay, that's asking for a lot of access to Greenhouse. Like, how are you going to protect it? And I had to say like, well, I'm only going to get these pieces of information. I'm going to anonymize it in this way. And then they were like, okay, great. And there was a bunch of back and forth about like, oh, it turns out I actually need this permission also. Can you add that to the key? Like, oh, I have to give you a new key, whatever. That is the part that took a while. It wasn't actually the convincing them to let me do this thing, especially because it was a hack day project. So like, it was my time. Anyone else? All right. Well, oh wait, one last one from the back.
This is not my personal opinion, just a proclaimer.
Are you playing devil's advocate?
Yes. How would you respond to those folks that do say, for example, if minorities and women are having a pay gap or a disparity where they become more necessary jobs or various other things, why don't we all just save the 2% or 20% or 18% compensation cost and hire all the women since they're a bargain? I don't believe that. I just want to hear your answer to it.
Are you saying that these people say we should hire more women because they're cheaper?
Correct. If there's a pay gap, then why isn't capitalism solving it?
Because capitalism is an inherently flawed system that we should burn to the ground.
Fair. Fair. That's why I put the proclaimer first, not my personal opinion, devil advocate, but yes.
But also, honestly, I would probably send them to one of my like cishet white friends, dude friends who are like ready to be allies. Like, all right, I got this 101 question for you. Like, I want to answer the 201 questions and let them answer the 101 questions. Okay, anyway, thanks.